All right, great. Good morning. Welcome to the February Special Ed POC monthly webinar. We will be getting started with our presentation for this month. As a few other folks are just getting logged in, I'm going to give it just another minute or so, and then we'll get started. Thank you so much. All right, great morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with the February broadcast for the LEA Special Ed Points of Contact monthly webinar. This webinar will give you updates and information in OSSE's Fed world and things that you need to know. This month, we will be presenting information, and our agenda for today will be transfer students. We know that a lot of folks are receiving or have received some transfer students, so we will be talking about transfer students and comparable service requirements, and also documenting those comparable services instead. We will talk about ESY as we're getting ready for ESY 2020. There'll be some reminders for access or non-public users, and then general reminders and announcements. So let's go ahead and get started. To walk us through the IEP implementation for our transfer students and the policy, I'd like to present now Christy Weaver-Harris.
Good morning, everybody. This is Christy Weaver-Harris with OSSE's Division of K-12 Systems and Support. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the IEP implementation for transfer students policy, go over some of your responsibilities for comparable services and some tips and best practices. And then Rita is going to walk you through how to document comparable services instead. So the IEP implementation for transfer students policy was released, I believe, in 2014, and it has not been updated since then. So the policy that you see on our website is still current and effective. It outlines specific LEA responsibilities for students when they transfer between LEAs, and that's for in-state transfers, so transfers between two DC LEAs, out-of-state transfers, and private school transfer students. It also addresses students who are transitioning from Part C services to Part B services. And it also encompasses students that are transferring with an existing IEP or with a pending referral or an in-process initial evaluation. So in those instances, the student may have a referral, but the actual evaluation hasn't been started, or they may have already started the initial evaluation. So under Chapter 30, in the interim since this policy was released, we have further clarified what your responsibilities are for students who are transferring between DC LEAs. So if a student transfers in-state between DC LEAs, so either from one public charter school to another public charter school, or from DCPS to a public charter school, or vice versa, if they transfer during the school year, you're responsible for providing special education services upon stage 4 enrollment. So that is when the student is registered in your SIS, and you should have access to their records after you register them in your SIS. If the student is transferring between school years, so over the summer generally, you are responsible for providing special education services to that student on the first day of school. Now, we made this change to make it clearer who was responsible and when, and also to account for ESY. So if a student is transferring between LEAs between school years and they are eligible for ESY, the prior LEA is responsible. And that is a little different than in some other states. It is definitely different from how we had approached it before, and it's actually different from what the federal guidance is on this. But for our purposes in the District of Columbia, it just makes a lot more sense that the prior LEA is responsible. We know that there were a lot of LEAs having trouble getting access to records, So we went ahead and put it in the law that for students who are transferring between school years during the summer, the new LEA is responsible on the first day of school. And you can always access that policy on our website. We have a landing page for all of our policies. So you can see right there, that's where the link is. So when a student transfers into your LEA, the new LEA is responsible for requesting the student's records from the previous LEA within 5 business days of enrollment. And you should be requesting both access to the student's record in SEDS and all paper records or other extraneous records that the student may have at that previous LEA. So the previous LEA must provide the student records to the new LEA within 10 business days of the request. And again, that includes the transfer of paper documents if needed. So if you're thinking about this in real practical terms, we're talking 15 business days of enrollment. That's 3 weeks. It's a lot of time for a student to not be receiving the services that they are entitled to. And it's a lot of time for a new school to not know a lot about a student who's coming from an old school. So we do ask that you effectuate the transfer of records as best as you can and as quickly as possible to make sure that students have access to what they need at the new school. So if the student is transferring from out of state, the LEA must upload the out-of-state IEP into SEDS within 10 business days of receipt. Again, that's a very long time. We're talking 2 weeks. So if you're getting that out-of-state IEP from the parent, go ahead and upload it into SEDS as soon as possible, but no later than 10 business days after you get it from the parent. If the new LEA is unable to obtain the student's IEP, your child find obligations then kick in. So if you're aware that this student is likely a student with a disability or you suspect that they may be a student with a disability, you should be entering a referral and then following the initial evaluation process. Especially for students who are transferring from out of state, you're going to have to determine their eligibility under district law anyway. It's helpful that you have the prior records from the old out-of-state LEA, but a lot of the time we know it can be difficult to get those records. So go ahead and submit a referral for that student and get the process started as soon as possible. So the new LEA, in consultation with the parents, is responsible for providing FAPE in the form of comparable services when students transfer in with an existing IEP. Comparable services are similar or equivalent to those described in the existing IEP. They are not exactly the same as, but they should be as close as possible. And if a student is transferring into your LEA with a district IEP, it should be assumed that you are able to fully implement that IEP. So comparable services should look very, very close to what is already on the student's IEP. And you should be providing that as soon as possible, but no later than 20 calendar days after receipt of the existing IEP. Again, 20 calendar days is a long time. Students should be provided comparable services as soon as possible when you get that existing IEP. And comparable services can include equitable services that are provided to students who are transferring in from a private school who have an individual services plan. So individual services plans or ISPs are different from IEPs because students in private schools do not have entitlements under IDEA in the same way that students in public schools do. So when you get a student who has an ISP, that document's going to look a little different, but you should be providing comparable services as appropriate, so the similar or equivalent to those that are described in the ISP. The LEA is also responsible for tracking and documenting the provision of comparable services in SEDS. So in-state IEPs are automatically transferred within SEDS upon request of the new LEA. In that instance, the comparable services tab isn't necessary because you already have all the information that you need about services for that student. And that's kind of what I was saying earlier when I said that an in-state IEP is presumed to be able to be implemented throughout the district. So for an out-of-state IEP and for private school ISPs, those must be manually updated into uploaded into SEDS using the transfer student intake process in the comparable services tab, which is what Rita's going to go over in a minute. But you are responsible for tracking and documenting the provision of comparable services within SEDS. So a couple of best practices here related to transfer students. When you get a Stage 4 enrolled student, you can then ask them if they have previously received special education services. Prior to Stage 4 enrollment, it is not recommended because of the risk of discrimination against students with disabilities. But once a student is Stage 4 enrolled in your LEA, you should be asking the parent for all prior documentation, including if they have documentation that the student previously received special education services. So ask for IEPs from incoming parents. You should be requesting records transfers as soon as possible, as I talked about earlier. We encourage you to pay attention to eligibility and IEP due dates so that you can better plan for triennial reevaluations and so that you can see whether the IEP is expiring or has expired. You cannot adopt an expired or expiring IEP. So by expiring IEP, I mean an IEP that will expire within 30 days. You cannot adopt that IEP, but you must provide comparable services on it, and you should be working to develop a new IEP. You should also begin collecting information and data on student performance as soon as is possible for you, so that you can better evaluate the appropriateness of the student's IEP and determine whether that student will need a full evaluation if that student's an out-of-state transfer student. You are able, for out-of-state transfer students, you can use the information available to you, including the student's existing IEP, to make an eligibility determination as part of your review of existing data. But if you're going to need additional information, you should start planning for that as soon as possible. And again, a best practice and also a requirement is to provide comparable services as soon as possible, but no later than 20 calendar days after receiving that student's existing IEP. So this is a pretty high-level overview of your responsibilities for transfer students. I do encourage you to review that policy because it is very detailed, especially with timelines. And we've done previous trainings on that too, but I wanted to give a quick overview because we are seeing some issues with provision and documentation of comparable services for these students. And we know, like Rita said, that we have a highly mobile population within the district, and this is a hot time of year for kids to be transferring between LEAs. I'm going to kick it back to Rita for her to go over how you document comparable services instead.
Thanks, Christy. All right, so we're now going to move into the actually how you go into SED and document some of this information. Just a couple of things as you're looking at the information we're presenting. When students are transferring from out of state with an existing IEP, as Christy pointed out, your new LEA is going to create that referral and document in the existing student data. They're going to do an eligibility determination in SED and also upload the out-of-state IEP document and create a comparable services document. So that's what I'll be showing you, those specific screens in SED to document this information. All right, so you should be working with the school registrar just to ensure that the transfer or the transfer student has been properly enrolled. Enrollment is the only way you're able to see the appropriate student records in SED. That's what makes them show up. So when you enroll that student in your SIS, we should be able to see access to that student in SED. Next, you'll go to the Comparable Services tab in SED, and you'll begin the transfer student intake process. This is where you are actually taking the information that the student is walking in with and starting to put it into the system. So as you can see from this screenshot of the comparable services process within SED, it's going to take you through that student transfer or transfer student intake. That's where you are basically putting in all of the information that the student is coming in with, and we're going to go into that in just a second. You'll do the consult letter. You'll discuss transportation, ESY, and then you will finally create the final comparable services consult letter that includes that student's disability. So you will be required to complete all sections of this process. So in the first section where you have the out-of-state IEP, once that out-of-state IEP is obtained, you can either scan it in or upload it into the student's record. Now, this is the same process that can be used for an individual service plan. So you can upload or scan it in and upload it into the student's record. Part 2 is the consult letter. You're creating the comparable services document by adding the specialized instruction and related services similar to or equivalent to what was already listed on that out-of-state IEP. So you're just putting in that information. Make sure you are using the same begin and end date for that service. So whatever that service is that was coming in from Virginia, you'll be putting the same start and end date for that service here in DC under your special ed and your related services tab. Part 3 of this process is for transportation. So the IEP team will determine if the student qualifies for transportation services. Now that, even if the student received transportation in the state that they're coming from, they still have to qualify for transportation services in the district. And this page just replicates the transportation page that's in the regular IEP process that will allow you the opportunity to complete the transportation eligibility worksheet. And as most folks know that are already using this process, you will have to go to TOTE to finish processing or to finish the process of requesting that transportation for your out-of-state student. Part 4 in the comparable services process is ESY. And this is where you're actually going to use the information that you have received or what the team is determining without waiting for the full IEP process is if the student was qualified for ESY services. And we need to document that information as part of the comparable services process. So this page, again, replicates the ESY page that's in the regular IEP process, and you're using that same information, including the ESY eligibility worksheet, to complete this section. Finally, in Part 4, you will generate the comparable services consult letter, and this is the last section of the process that really captures additional information that's needed for you to generate that comparable services letter. The LEA designee is going to sign this letter, and a copy of this is going to be provided to the parent in addition to a PWN. Now, I mentioned just a minute ago that part of this process you will be considering ESY, and this is a great segue into the next section of our presentation, where we talk a little bit more about things to come for ESY.
Hi, everybody. So ESY season is upon us, and we're trying to get as much information out to you about ESY as possible and as early as possible. So I'm going to go over some of your responsibilities for the 2020 ESY period. So in accordance with OSSE's ESY policy, each spring, all LEAs must certify ESY data to OSSE by the first Monday in May. This year, the first Monday in May is Monday, May 4th, 2020. So the purpose of ESY certification is to assist LEAs in non-public programs and appropriate planning so that you know what educational services you will be responsible for providing over the summer and for staffing for the summer months. And it also assists OSSE in anticipating state-level expenses and transportation needs. So OSSE does provide funding for ESY and also provides transportation services for students who are eligible for ESY-related transportation. So your timely submission of your data and your ESY eligibilities and your ESY-related TRF help OSSE to ensure that we are meeting our obligations also. So an LEA has completed ESY certification when all student-level decisions on ESY eligibility status, all ESY goals and services, and transportation eligibility and transportation information is updated and accurate and said as part of the finalized current IEP for that student. Sometimes if it's too early in the school year when that student's annual IEP is being reviewed, you may not be able to make an eligibility determination specifically around ESY at that time. And you may know that there's a couple of ESY eligibility determinations that you need to revisit ahead of the May 4th deadline. So now is the time to be scheduling those meetings and taking a look at students who may need services over your breaks. And I specifically say breaks because ESY can be provided at any point in time during the school year, during any sort of break. So we actually know that there are some charter schools that are, and DCPS I think, that are on break right now. If you believe that a student will regress to the point that they require ESY services during those breaks in service, we absolutely would expect that you would be finding that student eligible for ESY and providing services during breaks. ESY services are not summer school. I think you've heard me say that enough times over the last 8 years. But they can be provided at any point in time during the school year during a break. Most commonly, they are provided during the summer, but they are not specific to summer school. Again, the LEA has completed ESY certification when they've made all those student-level decisions and documented those in SEDS. The LEA has submitted ESY calendars and bell times, both in eSchool Plus in the SLED module and in TOTE. When student demographics, including addresses, eligibility, and ESY location information is confirmed in TOTE, and when transportation requests for all students requiring services have been submitted in TOTE. So a lot of our reliance upon this certification process is to ensure that the timely provision of transportation services. And again, the deadline for ESY certification this year is Monday, May 4th, 2020. Here is a chart of your responsibilities and the data systems in which you must complete those responsibilities. So in SEDS, you're going to be finalizing ESY eligibility and ESY transportation eligibility on students' IEPs. You could have been doing that as early as fall, but the final deadline for that is Friday, May 1, 2020. This is because it takes a day for those students to populate in TOTE. So you need to be finalizing your ESY eligibilities in SEDS by Friday, May 1, so that the systems can update, and then on Monday, May 4th, you will have access to that student in TOTE so you can submit the necessary information and TRS for that student. We also ask that you enter ESY calendar and ESY progress reporting dates by May 1 so that that information can also transfer over. And then as ESY is ongoing, you're going to be entering service trackers and progress reports. You're required to do that within 5 business days after ESY ends or after the last day that you've provided ESY for that student within SEDS. So in TOTE, you are required to complete transportation request forms for each student that is eligible for ESY transportation by Monday, May 4th, 2020. The earliest date that you'll be able to complete that is still to be determined. Usually it is sometime in the middle of March, but for the next webinar that we have in March, I think it's March 18th, we will have an update and a final date for that. But we're working on it right now. In eSchool Plus, you have to create your ESY calendar. You can start doing that as soon as March 23rd, 2020, and the final date to do that is also Friday, May 1, because that information needs to flow down into other systems so that you are able to indicate all of your information in SEDS and TOTE. For the SLED ESY module, we're asking that you input your ESY site locations. That will be open on April 6, 2020. And again, we ask that you complete that task by Friday, May 1, so that the systems can update appropriately in time for the certification due date of Monday, May 4th. You're also going to be assigning each ESY eligible student to an ESY site location. We ask that you start that as early as April 6th, but you can do that up until 2 days prior to the first day of ESY services. And then we also want you to be within the SLED ESY module. You must be indicating overall ESY attendance for the student. The earliest date that you can do that is as early as the first day if the parent or the student's guardian or the student themselves tells you that they will not be attending ESY. In the District of Columbia, consent for services, for special education services, is a blanket consent for all services. We do not allow parents to decline individual services under their blanket consent. So it's not possible for a student or for a parent when the IEP team determines that the student is eligible for ESY and they should receive ESY services. It's not technically possible for the parent to say, well, I revoke consent specific for that service. We don't have that in the district. But we do know that parents will tell you, my kid's not coming to ESY. If they tell you that and you have documentation of it, we do encourage you to go ahead and enter ESY attendance for that student. But you have to enter all final ESY attendance for students within 5 business days after ESY ends for the LEA.
Okay.
So OSSI has a lot of resources related to ESY. This is one of those weird parts of education that seems to be a sticking point. We have our ESY services policy that's available on our website. We also have an FAQ. Last year's February LEA SEPOC webinar gave a much more detailed overview of ESY eligibility determinations and SEDS documentation. Instead of presenting all that same information to you again, we encourage you to go review that webinar that is archived on our website. If you have any questions about your obligations related to ESY, please feel free to reach out to the policy team in the Division of K-12 Systems and Support, which is my team. You can always access us at ossi.dsepolicy@dc.gov. OSSI will also be issuing the 2020 ESY memo to LEA leaders and LEA SEPOCs in the coming weeks. It is in the final stages of being approved for release. And that memo, if you remember in years past, goes over your obligations for service provision, your data system obligations, your transportation obligations, and your tote obligations for that data system. And last year we released the memo and then got a lot of questions about closing charters. So we actually released a second memo last year around ESY obligations for students who are transferring from closing charters. This year's ESY memo incorporates that information again, but generally speaking, if a student is transferring into your LEA from a closing charter, if the charter is completely closing, the new LEA is responsible for providing ESY services. If the prior LEA is only partially closing and they still serve the age or grade band, so if they're only closing one school location, if they're still able to provide services to the age or grade band that student is in, the old LEA would still be responsible. Again, that's going to be covered in the memo. I think at this point it's like 8 pages. Like, it's a ton of information, so be on the lookout for that. Also, if you would like to receive that memo, make sure that you are indicated in eSchool Plus as an LEA SEPOC. I will be sending that memo to at least LEA heads of school, LEA data managers, and LEA special education points of contact. So make sure that you're indicated in eSchool Plus as one of those people, or go to your head of school or your LEA data manager or your LEA SEPOC and ask them for access to the memo. We'll also be sure to post it on our website, and it will probably be in the LEA Look Forward too. So it will be widely available, but it does provide a ton of synthesized information around what you're supposed to be doing for ESY. But we do anticipate getting that out sometime in early March. In years past, we've slipped into April a few times with it, but hopefully we'll be on the earlier side of that. We're seeing some questions around when is tote training for new folks. That is also included, there's information around that included in the memo, but you can always access tote training through our website. There's a registration link on OSSI's website. So if you have any questions related to ESY, please feel free to reach out. And again, we have all of those resources available.
Great.
Now, Pauline would like to talk to you about access for non-public users. This is a topic that we talk about a few times a year because it seems to be a persistent issue, but she's going to give you some reminders around your obligations for non-public users.
Thank you, Christy. Hi, my name is Pauline Miller-John. I just want to give you guys a little refresher on non-public access. We have been receiving numerous emails from non-public users as well as LEAs trying to assist in providing access to non-public users. So one of the things we talked about in previous previous webinars was the responsibility of the LEA SPED POC for protecting the privacy of their students. What we're finding with a couple of the requests is that users are, the non-public users are being added to LEA's site as well as the non-public school. When you add a user to your site, it allows the user to have access to all of your students. You're only supposed to add the user to the non-public school in which the students are being served. Another thing that's happening, we want to make sure that the students are properly enrolled at the non-public school. We are finding cases where students are enrolled at the LEA and not the non-public school, therefore the non-publics cannot get access to the student or is not seeing the student on their caseload. So make sure when you're enrolling the students, if the student originally attended your school, exit the student from your school and enroll them in the non-public school. Only then will the non-public user be able to get access to that student. Once that is completed, make sure you request access through OSC to give that user access to your LEA. OSC will then add the user to your site, your LEA site, and you are responsible for adding the user to the non-public school. I stress again, please do not add the users to your LEA in the drop-down list where it says school. Just add them to the non-public school in which they're servicing. Another thing that we've been getting a lot of stuff, emails about is aggregate account access. OSCE is the only one that can create an aggregate account access. What we're finding is that the user has an aggregate account. However, the LEAs are also creating individual accounts for the user. So what happens is when the user goes into their aggregate site, they're only seeing 2 schools in which they're servicing. However, they have students at multiple LEAs. So what's happening is that the LEAs are saying, I'm seeing the students assigned to the user, but the user cannot see the student. So we have to go ahead and merge the accounts now to make sure that the aggregate account reflects all the LEAs in which the user is seeing. So please be mindful of creating individual accounts in your LEA for users. If they have an aggregate account, we can determine that. If you're not sure, you can ask them if they service multiple schools. If they do, then they will need an aggregate account access. The next thing I wanted to cover, it says access for non-public staff requires that you work together with the LEA. I've been getting numerous emails from non-public users saying they're unable to reach the LEA point of contact to give them access. They have been calling. We have addressed on our end to ensure that we work with the liaisons who help support the LEAs to ensure that they're getting in contact with the LEA SPED POC so that they can assist the non-public users. Access that's not granted to a non-public user is making it very difficult for non-public users to create service logs, to put in information for the students, and they need to do this on a timely basis because it affects a lot of other working pieces. The non-public SPED point of contacts, if they're responsible, the SPED point of contact as a non-public is responsible for coordinating the SPED access and also training the non-public staff. I've noticed a lot of turnover for some of the non-public staff as well as the LEA, but if you're unclear of how to provide access or unclear of what to do, please reach out to the liaison. Each LEA have a DAR liaison here at OSCE, and they should be able to help you maneuver the system to provide access to the LEA, to the non-public user. LEA SPED POC are responsible for overseeing said access for any user, including the non-publics who serve the LEA. If there are any conflicts or any questions, there's a manager that oversees the DAR liaisons, but again, there is DAR liaison for each LEA that could help you maneuver some of the access. Also, we have the OSCE's help desk that can help the non-public SPED POC and the LEA POC to communicate if there are any issues. If you have any questions about this, or you need to get further clarification because you're unaware of any issues, or if you know of any non-public users that still haven't had access, please reach out to the DAR liaison so we can help you guys facilitate that access for the users.
Great. Thank you so much, Pauline.
And as a reminder, part of your obligations for students who are placed in non-public schools and as an LEA, the student remains enrolled in your LEA and you remain responsible for ensuring the provision of special education services for those students. And part of that obligation does include ensuring appropriate access for those non-public users. So this is actually part of your obligation to provide FAPE for the students who are enrolled in your schools. And we do strongly remind you that you need to be ensuring that the folks who are providing direct services to those students who are attending non-public schools have access to the records and the technology and the systems that they need to be able to provide those services as part of your obligation to provide FAPE.
Great, ladies. Thank you so much. So as we move on to the next section, which is our reminders, I just want to recap a little bit what Pauline said about the impact of adding these users to your LEA and not the non-public school. You're essentially giving them access to the entire school, not the non-public. Also, very important, don't create aggregate accounts. Well, you can't create aggregate accounts, but don't create accounts for people that should have aggregates. That should go through the OST. Only OST creates those aggregate accounts. And we want to make sure that access to the LEA, that you're doing the access to the LEA and not the non-public schools, so that folks are able to access the actual location in SED where that student is, whether that be in the non-public school or in a different school. So making sure that they're getting enrolled into the correct non-public school within your LEA. Thank you so much, ladies. We're going to move to the final portion of today's presentation, which reminders and announcements. And here, with the hot off the press announcement and reminder, is Jen Carpenter.
Hi, everyone. I just want to remind everyone to disseminate this information about how to sign up for OSCE's Teaching and Learning PD Bulletin. If you subscribe to the bulletin every month, you will receive a list of about the next 3 months of PD opportunities. That list is hyperlinked right to the registration. It's a lot less cumbersome than looking for PD and the LEA Look Forward. But having said that, you need to look at that too. Also, on this slide, there is a link to the full calendar of all PD training opportunities. That's just another way that you can look for things that are upcoming. I hope to see you here at training soon.
Great, thank you. As always, you can access any of our recorded or archived resources on the OSCE website. I've placed those links up on the screen for you. That includes Related Service Provision 101. That's for our related service providers and folks that function in that space. Also navigating the initial eligibility process within SES and our SES Basic User Guide. Thank you for attending today's presentation. Our next broadcast will be Wednesday, March 18th, 2020, where we will be providing you more timely information about things that are going on and happening in the SPED world. So if you want to access or if you need to refer any of your colleagues to today's broadcast, the recorded webinar will be posted on our website, same place. It will be posted on our website within 48 hours of the conclusion of this broadcast. Again, we thank you so much. We'll be staying on the line just a few more minutes to address some questions that folks are putting in the chat box. If you have questions, we invite you to stay on the line. If you don't have any other questions or concerns for today, have a great afternoon.
So we have received a couple of questions related to a few different things. We got a question around what LEA is responsible for providing ESY when the old LEA is closing, which I did address at the time, but just as a reminder, generally the new LEA is responsible unless the school that is closing is only closing a school site, and that LEA, the larger LEA, is still able to serve the age or grade band for that student. But again, that information will be included in this year's ESY memo. We also received a question around finalizing eligibility for a student based solely off of their prior IEP from a prior LEA or from an out-of-state LEA, or do you need to be conducting additional assessments to show that you actually did an evaluation to finalize a student's eligibility? You're never required to conduct additional assessments. You can always determine eligibility based on the data that is available to you without conducting an additional psychoeducational assessment or something like that. But the IEP team does need to make the determination that they don't need additional assessments in order to make that determination. Sometimes based on the eligibility criteria, you may need additional assessments to have the evidence that you need to show that your eligibility determination, but you are not required to do additional assessments if you have all the information available to you, or if you can make the determination based on the information available to you. And this is one of the situations where I strongly encourage LEAs to rely on your own knowledge and expertise and experience in special education to know how to do, or to know when a student is eligible for special education. If you have the information available to you, please rely on it and keep it moving. This also helps ensure that students are receiving timely access to, or timely eligibility determinations and timely access to services. So definitely, if you can use the prior IEP and the information available to you, please feel free to move forward with an eligibility determination on the basis of that information.